The fists landed before anyone could blink. 1 second, Corporal Ethan Cole was standing over her, jaw tight, eyes burning. The next, Chief Petty Officer Mara Callahan was on the floor. 51 years old, blood on her lip, mess hall gone dead silent around her. 30 soldiers held their breath. Mara didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't reach for anything. She looked up at him with eyes so still it made the room feel wrong, because in those 3 seconds of silence, she had already calculated exactly how to end him. She just chose not to. What Ethan Cole didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman bleeding on that floor had survived things that would break every man in that room. And he had just made the worst mistake of his life. If this story already has your pulse up, hit subscribe right now. Because every story on this channel hits harder than the last. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. Part 1 starts right now. The mess hall at Fort Ravenwood smelled the way all military mess halls smell. Industrial coffee, reheated protein, floor cleaner, trying to cover something older underneath. It was 0645 on a Tuesday in late October, the Arizona desert outside still cold enough to bite, and most of the soldiers inside were halfway through their eggs before the noise started. It began with a chair. Corporal Ethan Cole dragged it back from a table near the center of the room and dropped into it like he owned the floor, which was more or less how he treated every room he walked into. He was 30 years old, 6'2", built like someone who treated the gym as religion. His record was decent. 2 overseas rotations, a commendation for marksmanship, a reputation that had preceded him to Fort Ravenwood by 2 weeks. The reputation said he was gifted. It also said he was the kind of gifted that had started to curdle. He was halfway through his coffee when he saw the tray land across the table from him. Chief Petty Officer Mara Callahan set it down without looking at him. She was in her utilities, no rank on display beyond the standard insignia, hair pulled back in the regulation knot she'd been wearing since before Ethan Cole had finished high school. She was 51. Her face showed it, not in a broken way, but in the way that outdoor time and stress and years of not sleeping enough leaves marks that no amount of gym work erases. She sat down with her coffee and her single piece of toast and pulled out a small spiral notebook, the kind you'd find in any office supply store. She started writing. Ethan watched her for about 4 seconds. "You're in my seat." Mara didn't look up. "There are 43 empty seats in this room," she said, "and this one has my tray on it." The soldiers nearest them went quieter. Not silent yet, just a degree lower, the way a room adjusts when it senses something incoming. Ethan's jaw shifted. "I sit here every morning." "Then you have a routine." She turned a page in her notebook. "That's good. Routines are useful." Someone 2 tables over let out a short sound that was almost a laugh and immediately converted it into a cough. Ethan heard it. His ears went slightly red. "You know who I am?" he said. Mara finally looked up. She had gray eyes, not the soft kind, the kind that looked like they'd seen enough to stop being surprised by most things. She studied him for exactly as long as it took to understand what she was dealing with. "Yes," she said. "I know who you are." She went back to her notebook. That was the moment, right there, that flat, unbothered return to the page, that broke something in Ethan Cole. Because he had walked into rooms his whole career and received a particular response. Attention, deference. Sometimes fear, sometimes admiration, but always acknowledgement. This woman had just looked at him like he was mildly interesting weather and gone back to her writing. He stood up. "Get out, rookie." His voice was loud enough now. The room went still for real. "You don't belong here." Mara looked up again. Something moved behind her eyes. Not anger, not fear. Something older and harder to name. She started to close her notebook. She didn't see the fist coming. Or maybe she did and made a choice. The blow caught her across the left cheek, not full force but enough. Enough to knock her off the bench and put her on the concrete floor with her tray clattering beside her. Coffee spread in a dark stain. The notebook slid 3 feet from her hand. 31 soldiers did not move. Mara lay on her side for a moment. A single line of blood appeared at the corner of her lip. She pressed one hand flat to the floor and pushed herself upright with the steady, mechanical patience of someone who had gotten up off worse surfaces than this. She sat on the floor. Didn't stand yet. Just sat there, one hand resting on her knee, and looked at a point on the wall past Ethan's shoulder. And in the space behind her eyes, which nobody in that room could read, she ran the geometry. Right knee, one strike, lateral. His shoulder, already slightly forward from the punch, easy hyperextension with the right grip. Consciousness, gone in under 4 seconds with a proper carotid compression. 3 seconds, realistically, maybe 2.5. She picked up her notebook. She stood up. She looked at Ethan Cole with those flat gray eyes and said nothing at all. Then she walked out of the mess hall carrying her coffee, which had somehow not spilled. Captain Elena Reyes was in her office when the report landed on her desk at 07:20. She read it twice. Then she read the witness statements, all 8 of them, collected in the 11 minutes between the incident and the time her duty sergeant had walked the paperwork up. She set the folder down and looked at the wall for a moment. The report said, CPO Callahan sustained minor injury during an altercation with CPL Cole. CPO Callahan declined medical evaluation. CPO Callahan declined to file charges. What the report didn't say was what Staff Sergeant Darnell Webb had told Reyes verbally, standing in her doorway 5 minutes earlier with his cap in his hands. Ma'am, the way she got up, I've seen guys who've been in the desert 3 tours get up slower than that. Reyes pulled up Mara Callahan's service file on her terminal. The first 3 screens were standard: assignment history, evaluation scores, administrative notes. Then she hit the wall. Access restricted, authorization required. Not one line of restriction, not a partial block. Everything before 6 weeks ago, classified. Reyes leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. She had been an operations officer for 9 years. She had seen restricted files before. Contractors with sensitive backgrounds. Analysts with clearance requirements. Special operations types who passed through and whose records were never fully visible to conventional command staff. But she had never seen a record with this kind of coverage. 6 weeks of visible history, and then a wall as clean and complete as a closed door. She picked up her phone. Mara was in the medical bay at 07:30, not because she'd requested it, but because the duty medic had been dispatched by someone with enough authority to make it non-optional. She sat on the examination table while Specialist Tron worked on her lip with antiseptic and the careful fingers of someone who was trying not to make the situation strange. "You've had stitches before," Tron said. It wasn't quite a question. "A few," Mara said. "These don't need them, just pressure." Tron paused. "You want ice for the cheekbone?" "I'm fine." Tron looked at the bruise forming under Mara's left eye, decided to offer the ice anyway, and was unsurprised when Mara accepted it without comment. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Tron asked. "A misunderstanding," Mara said. Tron looked at her for a long moment. Mara was already looking at the wall. Not upset, not performing calm, just genuinely somewhere else in her head, working through something with the focused quiet of a person doing math. "Okay," Tran said, and let it go. The formal interview with Captain Reyes happened at 0900. Reyes's office was neat in the way that spoke to constant effort rather than natural order. Stacks of binders exactly squared, a whiteboard with color-coded unit timelines, a single personal photograph facing away from visitors. She stood when Mara entered and gestured to the chair across from her desk, which Mara took without the usual waiting for permission pause that most enlisted personnel still did by reflex. Reyes noticed that. "Chief Callahan," she said, settling into her own chair. "How's your face?" "Functional," Mara said. "The duty medic says the bruising is significant." "I've had worse bruising from a doorframe." Reyes opened the folder in front of her without looking at it. "You declined to press charges." "It was an accident," Mara said. The silence that followed was the kind that Reyes used deliberately. She let it run for about 6 seconds, watching Mara's face, watching her hands, watching the way she sat in the chair with her spine straight but not rigid, the posture of someone who had spent a long time making herself comfortable in situations designed to be uncomfortable. "An accident," Reyes repeated. "Staff Sergeant Webb says Corporal Cole threw a deliberate punch." "Sergeant Webb is enthusiastic," Mara said. "He may have misread the situation." 8 witnesses. "People misread things collectively all the time." Reyes looked at her for a long moment. "Chief, with respect, I've been doing this job for 9 years. I know the difference between someone who doesn't want trouble and someone who is very deliberately choosing not to escalate something." Mara held her gaze, said nothing. "Your record," Reyes said carefully. The parts I can access. Yes? They show you arrived here 6 weeks ago. Transfer from a logistics coordination center in Virginia. Prior to that, Reyes stopped. I can't see prior to that. No, Mara agreed. You can't. Is there anything you want to tell me? Mara looked at the whiteboard with its color-coded timelines. She looked at the photograph facing away from her. She looked at Captain Reyes, who was sharp and professional and clearly more intelligent than the base's administrative structure probably required. I want to tell you, Mara said, that Corporal Cole doesn't need charges. He needs consequences he can actually learn from. She paused. Charges will make him defensive. Something else will make him better. Reyes studied her. That's a very specific perspective on corrective action. I've had occasion to think about it. Reyes closed the folder. She made a note on a separate pad, a short one, 3 words at most, and angled the pad so Mara couldn't read it. Not that Mara tried. You're going to be here 3 months, Reyes said. Logistics coordination support. That's what your orders say. Yes. Is that what you're actually here for? The pause before Mara answered was exactly 1 breath long. I'm here to do my job, Captain. Reyes looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded slowly, like someone filing something away for later. Dismissed, Chief. Ethan Cole spent the morning in a state he would have described to anyone who asked as fine, which was the state he usually occupied when something had happened that he didn't want to examine too closely. He did his PT at the standard time. He checked his gear. He ran his rifle through a functions check that his hands could do in the dark without thinking, which was good because his head wasn't entirely on it. He kept seeing her eyes. Not the moment before she hit the floor. He'd filed that away in the category of things that didn't count. Mistakes that happened when someone pushed the wrong button at the wrong time. What he kept seeing was after. The way she'd gotten up. The way she'd looked at him with those gray eyes and nothing. No rage, no tears, no threatening to report him, and just walked out. Like he wasn't even worth reacting to. He went to the motor pool at 1100 because he had a maintenance check scheduled, and because being around engines cleared his head. Private First Class Devin Marsh was already there, torso halfway under a Humvee, and he pulled himself out when Ethan came in. Heard about this morning, Marsh said. Don't, Ethan said. I said don't. Marsh pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped his hands and went back under the vehicle. Ethan stood at the workbench and stared at his own reflection in a grease-spotted window for a while. That woman hadn't even flinched when she stood up. He didn't know what to do with that. At 400, Major Daniel Cross arrived at Fort Ravenwood. He arrived the way certain officers arrive, without announcement, without visible urgency, but with the particular weight of someone whose presence immediately rearranges the atmosphere of a room. He was 53, built lean rather than large, with short gray hair and the kind of face that had clearly been good-looking once and now just looked experienced. He wore his oak leaves without decoration and carried nothing except a black bag and a tablet. He requested the conference room. By 14:30, Reyes was in that conference room, and by 14:45, she came out looking like someone who had just received information that substantially reorganized her understanding of the last 6 weeks. At 1500, the order went out, mandatory unit assembly, 0600 the following morning. All personnel assigned to the base's combined training element, 32 soldiers from various components, including 1 Navy Chief Petty Officer on logistics coordination detail. The subject of the assembly was listed as Tactical Readiness Evaluation, 5-day exercise. Ethan Cole read the notice in the barracks hallway and felt something sharpen in his chest. Evaluations he understood. Evaluations were a language he was fluent in. He was already running the math in his head, who the competition would be, what the metrics likely were, where he would rank by day 3. He didn't notice the line at the bottom of the notice that listed the evaluation cadre. He noticed it the next morning. The 0600 assembly was held in the main briefing room, which smelled of old coffee and the particular brand of collective anxiety that a group of soldiers produces when they know they're about to be tested but don't know exactly how. Major Cross stood at the front of the room with Captain Reyes to his left and a blank projector screen behind him. He let them stand at attention for 12 seconds longer than necessary, not much, but enough to be felt, before he said, at ease. 5 days, he said. You will be evaluated on individual combat skills, small unit tactics, medical response, command decision-making under stress, and leadership behavior. Your performance will become part of your permanent record. Any questions before we begin? No one asked questions. That was standard. Evaluation cadre is as follows. He read names from his tablet. 2 captains from the Special Forces Training Command, a master sergeant with an air assault background. And then, Chief Petty Officer Mara Callahan, Naval Special Warfare, will serve as primary medical and tactical evaluation lead. The room moved, not dramatically. There were no gasps, no visible reactions that would have been reportable. But there was a shift, a micro-adjustment of posture and attention that ran through the assembled soldiers like a current, and it stopped and concentrated on Ethan Cole, who was standing in the 3rd row with his arms at parade rest and his face doing something careful and controlled. Mara was standing to Cross's right. She had not been there when the soldiers filed in, or rather, she had been there, near the back wall, and no one had registered her as part of the cadre because she looked exactly like what her orders said she was. An administrative support NCO attending a briefing. Now she stepped forward. The bruise under her left eye had deepened overnight to a color somewhere between purple and greenish yellow. She stood in front of the assembled soldiers with her notebook in one hand and her eyes moving across the room in a steady sweep that was nothing like an administrator taking attendance. "When you're ready, Major," she said. Cross nodded. "Day 1 begins in 20 minutes. Get your gear." Ethan caught up to Marsh in the hallway, moving fast toward the equipment bay. "She's on the cadre," Marsh said. "I noticed," Ethan said. "She's an evaluator." "I noticed that too." His voice was flat and tight in the way that meant he was working on something internal that he didn't want visible. "Cole, I'm just saying, I'm going to perform at the top of this evaluation," Ethan said. "That's the end of it." Marsh looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," he said, but he said it with the voice of someone who was not entirely sure that was going to be the end of it. Day 1 of the evaluation was the kind of day designed to show the seams. It opened with a physical assessment that was straightforward enough. Run, obstacle course, load-bearing movement over distance, and then moved immediately into a practical tactical exercise that was not straightforward at all. The exercise was a building clearance problem. 4-person teams were given a floor plan of a simulated compound, 3 interconnected structures, multiple rooms, 2 known hostile positions, and an unknown number of others, and 40 minutes to develop a clearance plan before execution. Ethan's team, himself, Marsh, Specialist Kate Ewan, and Corporal James Rourke. He took point on the planning immediately. "Stack on the main entrance," he said, spreading the floor plan on a folding table in the staging area. "Breach here, clear left to right, hit the courtyard from the western side. Breachers go first, I'm second, Ewan, then Rourke on rear security." "What about the secondary structure?" Ewan asked. She was pointing to the attached building on the eastern side of the compound. "If there are additional contacts in there, anyone coming out the courtyard is exposed. We clear the main building first, then the secondary." "That's a long time to leave the eastern side uncontrolled," Rourke said carefully. "We control it after we've cleared the main." Mara was standing 8 feet away, clipboard open, writing notes in her small spiral notebook. She wasn't looking at them. "What's the civilian status?" Ewan asked. "The brief mentioned possible non-combatants." "Unknown," Ethan said. "Standard rules of engagement. Threat identification before engagement. So if there are civilians in the main building and we breach hard from the front, we identify threats before we engage." "I just said that." Mara stopped writing. She looked at the floor plan. She looked at it for 4 seconds, said nothing, and made another note. The exercise ran at 11:30. Ethan's breach was clean. His first 2 room clears were textbook, crisp movement, angles covered, calls made. He was fast and he was accurate and he knew it. The civilian complication arrived in room 4. A role player in a white shirt seated at a table in the middle of the room with both hands visible and a controlled radio 2 feet from his right hand. Ethan's point man, Marsh, went in fast and identified the civilian correctly and called it. Ethan came through the door behind him. "Radio," Ethan said. "He hasn't touched it," Marsh said. "Remove it." Copy. Removing." The role player reached for the radio. Marsh hesitated for exactly 1 second, the correct second, because the role player reaching for the radio in a non-threatening situation was a judgment call, not an automatic response. And in that second, Ethan shouted a command that was loud and ambiguous, and caused Rourke in the hallway to misread the situation and breach the door to the adjacent room before the team had cleared their current position. The secondary room contained 2 role players tagged as civilians. By the exercise's internal logic, Rourke had just created a situation with unsecured non-combatants in a room with no cover and a hostile contact still outstanding in the eastern structure. The scenario was frozen by the range officer. Ethan's team stood in the simulated compound while the evaluators conferred. The debrief happened standing in the courtyard, sun starting to push through the cold air, everyone's breath visible. Mara led it. "Talk me through the Room 4 decision," she said, looking at Ethan. The civilian reached for a control radio, potentially significant asset. "The role player's movement," Mara said. "Describe it." He moved his hand toward the radio. "How far?" Ethan paused. 4 inches, maybe 6. And your response was an ambiguous, audible command that your rear security element interpreted as, "I know what happened," Ethan said. "I'm asking you to describe it." The color in Ethan's jaw shifted. "I issued a command that Rourke misread. He breached early." "Why did he misread it?" "Because the command wasn't—" He stopped. "Wasn't what?" "Wasn't specific," Ethan said. "He said it the way a person says something when they need to say it but would rather not." Mara made a note. "The eastern structure," she said. "Ewan flagged it in planning. Rourke flagged it. Your response?" "I determined the primary structure was the priority." "So you chose linear clearance in a compound with 2 interconnected structures?" "Yes." "What was your plan for the flank exposure during primary clearance?" A pause. "The flank was accepted risk." "Accepted risk," Mara said, and wrote it down without editorial inflection, which somehow made it worse. "Okay. What would you change?" Ethan looked at her. "Corporal," she said, and there was nothing sharp in her voice, nothing pointed, just expectation. "What would you change?" "Split element," he said. "Simultaneous breach on both structures, or hold the secondary entrance while the primary team clears. Which option fits your personnel?" "Split element requires 2 breachers. You have Ewan. When is—" He stopped again. Mara's eyes stayed level on him. "Ewan is capable," he finished. "Yes," Mara said. "She is." She closed her notebook. "The rest of you, good movement on the initial breach. Marsh, your civilian ID was correct, and your hesitation was appropriate. Think about what you would have done differently with a clearer call from team lead." She walked back toward the range officer. Ethan stood in the courtyard with his team not looking at him. The afternoon ran a medical response scenario. A simulated vehicle rollover with 4 casualties, varying severity, in a field environment 60 meters from a designated casualty collection point. The teams had basic trauma kit, a radio, and 12 minutes from scenario start. Ethan's team moved fast. Marsh handled a simulated penetrating chest wound with a seal that the evaluating medic marked as adequate. Rourke carried the mobility-impaired casualty. Ethan coordinated movement and radio communication simultaneously. They were on pace until Ewan flagged the 4th casualty, a role player tagged with a simulated tension pneumothorax, presenting with tracheal deviation and diminished breath sounds on the affected side. "Needle decompression," Ewan said. "That's outside our scope," Ethan said. He was already on the radio calling the simulated 9 line. "If we wait for evac, it's outside our scope," Ethan said again. "Get them moving." Mara had been observing from 10 meters away. She stepped in. "Freeze." Everything stopped. "The casualty," she said, crouching next to the role player. "What's your assessment?" Ethan started to answer. "Not you," Mara said, not harshly. "Specialist Ewan." Ewan ran the assessment out loud. Breath sounds, tracheal position, increasing respiratory distress, timeline since injury. When she finished, Mara looked at Ethan. "She's right," Mara said. "What's your tactical combat casualty care protocol for tension pneumo in a non-permissive environment?" "Needle decompression is a paramedic or physician skill in civilian—" "We're not in a civilian environment," Mara said. "TCCC protocol." "What does it say?" Ethan's jaw worked. "It authorizes the procedure for trained personnel under operational conditions." "Is Ewan trained?" A pause. "She's qualified." "So?" Ethan looked at Ewan. Ewan looked at the simulated casualty. The range around them was very quiet. "Proceed," Ethan said. Ewan ran the procedure correctly. The range evaluating medic marked it as clinically appropriate. The scenario ended. They walked back to the staging area. Ethan said nothing. At the equipment bay, pulling off his kit, Marsh got close enough to say quietly, "She's the real thing, man." "Shut up," Ethan said, but he said it without his usual force. And when he looked at the bruise on Mara Callahan's face across the bay, she was writing in her notebook, unconcerned with the sunset going red over the desert behind her. He felt something shift in his understanding of the situation, that he was not yet, ready to let himself finish thinking. He picked up his rifle and walked away from it. But the thought followed him out into the Arizona dark and sat with him through dinner and all the way into the silence of his rack at 2200, and it was still there when he finally closed his eyes. Who was she? The question followed Ethan Cole into the next morning like something that had taken up residence in the back of his skull and didn't intend to leave. He was on the range by 0545, 20 minutes before the formation call, running dry drills with his rifle in the gray pre-dawn light because movement was the only thing that reliably cleared his head. The desert around Fort Ravenwood was still cold at that hour, the kind of cold that came up from the ground rather than down from the sky, and the mountains to the east were just beginning to separate themselves from the dark. He ran the drill. Indexed, acquired, trigger press, reset, again. The image kept coming back. Mara Callahan on the floor of the mess hall, one hand flat, pushing up without hurry, without theater. The way she'd looked at him from the ground with those gray eyes that had the temperature of deep water. The way she'd picked up her notebook. Walked out. He'd hit people before. In training, in the ring, once in a bar in Savannah, that he didn't like to remember clearly. People reacted when you hit them. They cried, or they got loud, or they came back at you. Even the tough ones showed you something. She hadn't shown him anything. He lowered the rifle and looked at the mountains. She'd shown him nothing because he wasn't worth showing it to. That was the conclusion he kept arriving at and kept backing away from. And he was doing it again when boots hit gravel behind him and Staff Sergeant Webb materialized from the direction of the barracks, coffee in hand, face wearing the expression of someone who had also not slept especially well. "You're early," Webb said. "So are you." Webb stood beside him, looking at the range. He had the good sense to drink his coffee in silence for almost a full minute before he said, "You went over the debrief notes?" "Yes." "The needle decompression call?" I said yes. "Ewan flagged it twice," Webb said, not accusing, just stating. "Before the scenario and during. I know what happened." "I'm not talking about what happened. I'm talking about why." Webb drank his coffee. "You didn't trust her read." Ethan didn't answer. "That's a different problem than making the wrong call," Webb said. "The wrong call is a training issue. Not trusting your people's assessment is a command issue." "I trust my people." "Then why didn't you let Ewan run the assessment?" Ethan put the rifle in safe and looked at Webb directly. "You want to have this conversation at 0550 in the morning?" "I want to have it before she writes up the formal evaluation," Webb said. He nodded toward the headquarters building. "She was in there at 0500. I saw the light." Ethan looked at the headquarters building. A single window lit yellow against the pre-dawn gray. "She doesn't sleep much," he said. It wasn't a question. "Apparently not," Webb said. He finished his coffee. "I've seen that before. Guys who've been in the kind of situations where sleep is a liability. The habit sticks." Ethan said nothing. Webb took his empty cup and walked back toward the barracks. The light in the headquarters window stayed on. Day 2 started with a navigation problem. Individual, no GPS, no radio, 48 hours from drop point to objective using terrain association and dead reckoning. The desert landscape around Fort Ravenwood was not forgiving. The route included 2 ridge crossings, one canyon floor where the temperature dropped 15 degrees in the shade, and a water source that existed on the map and may or may not have existed in reality. They were dropped in 2-hour intervals, solo. Mara was not evaluated. She was at the second checkpoint, the ridge crossing, when Ethan arrived at 1340 with dust on his face and his water down to the last third. He had made good time, better than he'd expected, actually, because the ridge approach he'd selected turned out to be slightly more direct than the obvious route. She was sitting on a flat rock at the checkpoint with her notebook and a water bottle and a radio on the ground beside her. She looked up when he came in, noted his arrival time on her clipboard, and handed him a stamped card for his route log. "Water," she said, and it wasn't a question or an offer. It was an instruction, and she was pointing to a cash container 3 meters to her right. He topped off his canteen without argument. "You took the northeast approach," she said. "It was more direct. By about 400 meters. The gradient on the upper section is steeper. But shorter." "Yes." She made a note. "Good call if your legs are in good shape. What's your water discipline been?" 250 mil every 40 minutes. "You're down further than that." He looked at his canteen. "I had a harder section on the canyon floor than I expected." "What did you do wrong?" He looked at her. "On the canyon floor," she said. "What did you do that cost you water?" He thought about it honestly, which was a small and specific kind of discomfort. "I moved too fast in the first third. Before the shade kicked in. Body temperature went up." "Right." She made another note. "Next checkpoint is 6 kilometers. The route goes across open ground for the first 2. Move in the first hour or after 1700. I know desert movement." "Then you already know to wait until 1700, she said, and went back to her notebook. He stood there for a moment with his canteen and his stamped card. The desert was completely silent except for the distant scrape of wind across the ridge above them. "Why are you here?" he said. She looked up. "Fort Ravenwood," he said. "Logistics coordination. Your jacket says Virginia before this, and before Virginia there's nothing. Nobody does 6 weeks at a base like this on a logistics detail coming from wherever you came from." Mara held his gaze for a long moment. A bird called somewhere on the ridge, a sharp single note, and then nothing. "I'm here to do my job," she said. It was exactly what she had told Reyes. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I'm giving you." She looked back at her notebook. "Move at 1700. Stay on the ridge approach to the final checkpoint. The canyon route looks shorter on the map, and it isn't." He wanted to push. He could feel the question still sitting in him, hot and insistent. But she had already stopped looking at him, and there was something in the quality of her non-attention that communicated, very clearly, that the conversation was over. He left at 1700. He took the ridge approach. He didn't think about the water on the canyon floor because she had already told him not to. The evaluation results from day 1 were posted at 0600 on day 3. Not publicly. They went to individual personnel files and were summarized verbally by Major Cross at the morning brief. Cross read through the team scores with the measured neutrality of someone who had done this many times and knew how to deliver numbers without inflection. Ethan's team was 3rd out of 5. The building clearance scenario had cost them significantly. The medical response had recovered some ground. Ethan sat in the 2nd row and kept his face correct. Afterward, in the equipment bay, Ewan was checking her kit when Ethan came in. She looked up and looked back down. "Ewan," he said. She didn't stop checking. "Cole." "The needle decompression call. You were right." She looked up then. Her expression was careful. Not warm, not cold, just measuring. "I know," she said. "I should have trusted your rad." "Yeah," she said. "You should have." She went back to her equipment. "Are we done?" "For now," he said. She nodded and kept working. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't reconciliation, and it was, in its own limited way, exactly what it needed to be. Day 3's primary exercise was a command and control problem, a simulated company-level contact scenario in which team leaders had to coordinate fire support, casualty management, and movement to a secondary objective simultaneously, with communications gear that had been deliberately degraded to simulate a contested environment. The radio handsets were functional but intermittent. The encryption module on 2 of the 5 available sets had been physically restricted, so they dropped signal every 3rd transmission. This was realistic in the way that genuinely bad situations are realistic, which is to say it was specifically designed to make everything harder in ways you couldn't anticipate and couldn't fix. Ethan was assigned as team lead for the northern element. His job was to suppress a simulated enemy position on a ridgeline, enable the southern element's movement to the objective, and maintain communication with the command post throughout. He understood the problem clearly. He had planned for the radio degradation, assigning his 2 best communicators to the functional handsets and building a relay procedure that would keep the CP informed even when direct communication broke down. The scenario started at 0900. For the first 40 minutes, it went reasonably well. His suppression element got into position correctly. He established relay communication with the CP through Marsh, who was running the better of his two functional handsets with the focused competence of someone who had decided to be excellent at one specific thing on this particular day. The problem arrived at minute 43 in the form of a simulated casualty. Rourke, playing a team member who had taken a round to the lower leg, role-playing the injury with the commitment of someone who'd been briefed to make it difficult. "Cole," Rourke said, his voice pitched down to the flat register that soldiers use when something is wrong and they don't want to escalate the information. "I'm hit. Lower right." Ethan assessed in 3 seconds. Rourke's position was 7 meters from the suppression line, not in a direct fire lane, but close enough. Moving him would require pulling one person from the suppression element. Keeping him in position meant treating in place. "Tourniquet," Ethan said. Marsh relayed to CP. "We have a casualty, category Bravo, treating in place." "Copy," Marsh said, and got on the radio. The relay failed. The encryption dropout hit at exactly the wrong moment, and Marsh's transmission went out as fragmented noise. The CP, operating on its own degraded timeline, read it as a request for fire support rather than a casualty report, and responded with a fire mission that had no relationship to Ethan's actual situation. Ethan heard the CP's response in his earpiece and stopped. "That's not what I asked for," he said. "I know," Marsh said. "The relay ate it. Send it again." "I'm trying. The module is dropping again." The suppression element needed to maintain fire. Rourke needed a tourniquet adjusted. The simulated injury had a timer on it, a real-world evaluator watching a stopwatch 20 meters away. The CP needed corrected information before it tasked assets that didn't exist in this direction. Ethan was doing 3 things at once, and they were all degrading simultaneously. He handled Rourke first. That was the right call, and he made it without hesitation, directing Ewan to finish the tourniquet adjustment while he physically crossed to Marsh and retransmitted the casualty report himself, his voice flat and precise, using the brevity code they'd established in planning so the message survived a partial dropout. The CP acknowledged correctly this time, but the suppression element, without direction for 40 seconds, had drifted. 2 soldiers had shifted their position independently, creating a gap in the fire line that the scenario's evaluators marked as an exploitable break. When the scenario froze, Ethan was standing in the middle of his element with 3 things partially resolved, and one of them marked wrong. The debrief was held at the base of the ridge in the afternoon sun, everyone standing, nobody happy. Mara ran it. "The casualty decision," she said, looking at Ethan. "Talk me through it." "Treated in place, kept suppression active." "And the tourniquet delay?" "I redirected Ewan from the fire line to complete treatment." "How long was Ewan off the line?" Ethan counted backward in his head. 90 seconds, maybe 100. "The gap in the suppression line?" "Yes." "What could you have done differently?" He'd been thinking about it since the scenario froze. "Assigned a dedicated medic asset before the scenario started, or at minimum a secondary, so pulling Ewan didn't create a gap. You had the personnel. I used them for comms redundancy instead. So you made a resource allocation decision in planning that cost you in execution." "Yes." Mara wrote something down. "The radio problem." The relay procedure failed on first attempt. "You built a single relay procedure," she said, not accusingly. "One backup to direct comms. Standard doctrine. In a low-degradation environment, yes." She looked at him steadily. "What did the scenario brief tell you about the communications environment?" He went still. He thought about the brief, which had been thorough, which he had read, which had included the phrase heavy signal degradation expected across all frequencies in the 3rd paragraph. It said heavy degradation, he said. So single relay wasn't sufficient. A pause. "No." "What's the solution?" "Double relay, chain of 3 communicators minimum. I had the personnel." "You had the personnel," Mara agreed. She closed her notebook. "The CP fire mission response, you caught it and corrected it. That was right. Your casualty treatment decision was right. Your timing on the tourniquet redirect was right." She looked at the whole group. "The planning phase is where this went wrong. The execution was as good as the plan allowed it to be." She looked back at Ethan specifically. "The plan limited you." It was the most precise and efficient form of criticism Ethan Cole had ever received, and it left him with nothing to argue against and nothing to dismiss, and that was somehow worse than being shouted at. Across the debrief circle, he caught Webb watching him with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, but was adjacent to it. That evening, Ethan was in the day room at 2030, coffee in front of him, not drinking it. The television in the corner was showing sports that he wasn't watching. 3 other soldiers were in the room, and none of them were talking to him, which was fine. He was thinking about planning, not tactically, or not only tactically. He was thinking about the larger pattern, which was becoming visible to him the way certain things become visible only from a particular distance. The way he entered every situation, assuming the most important variable was his own performance, and the way that assumption caused him to allocate resources around himself and leave gaps elsewhere. He was thinking about the mess hall, about the thing he had done and how he'd categorized it immediately. A mistake, a momentary thing, a button pushed at the wrong time, and how that categorization was itself a version of the same pattern. Allocate responsibility outward, leave the gap. He hadn't done it consciously. That was the uncomfortable part. The door opened and Mara came in. She went to the coffee station at the side of the room, poured a mug, and sat at the table nearest the window. Not his table, not close, but in the same room. She pulled out her notebook. Ethan watched her for a moment. She didn't look up. "You're always writing in that thing," he said. She looked up, evaluated the situation, looked back down. "Notes," she said. "On us." "Evaluation records, yes. What does it say about me so far?" She turned a page. "What would you like it to say?" He looked at his coffee. "I don't know yet." She wrote something. He couldn't read the angle. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She kept writing. "You can ask." "Why didn't you press charges?" "After the mess hall." The writing stopped. She set down the pen. She looked at him. Really looked, the way she hadn't since she'd gotten up off that floor. And he understood now what he hadn't understood then, which was that the steadiness in those gray eyes wasn't absence of feeling. It was control. It was the product of years of practice. "Because charges would have made this about me," she said, "and it isn't." "Then what is it about?" She picked up the pen again. "That's a better question than most of the ones you've been asking." He sat with that for a moment. "I don't know what to do with you," he said. It came out more honest than he intended. Mara looked at him one more time. A fraction of something moved in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but something more human than the evaluator face. Here and then gone. "You don't need to do anything with me," she said. "You need to do something with yourself." She closed the notebook and stood up with her coffee. "Get some sleep, Corporal. Tomorrow is a longer day." She left. The television played sports at the wall. Ethan's coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. Day 4 arrived with weather. Not the dramatic desert storm kind, but a sustained low-pressure system that pushed cloud cover over the mountains and dropped the temperature 12 degrees and made the landscape feel different, compressed, like everything had been moved slightly closer together. The mountains to the east were invisible behind gray. The exercise was the one all of them had known was coming since Cross had briefed the 5-day structure on the first morning. A full 48-hour field problem, continuous, no base camp, living and operating from patrol configuration in a designated training area 15 kilometers from the main post. They inserted at Yo 600 by vehicle and were on foot by 0645, each soldier carrying 70 to 80 pounds depending on assignment, moving into the training area under cloud cover with Mara at the rear of the element and Cross at the front. The first 12 hours were movement and setup, establishing a patrol base, designating security sectors, running communications checks, rotating through watch. Standard field discipline, the kind of thing every soldier in the element had done before, but always revealing because field conditions stripped away the habits people maintained in garrison. Ethan was functioning, better than functioning. He was methodical, he was communicating with his team more than he had been on day 1, and he was listening to Ewan's assessments when she offered them without the half-second of resistance that had been costing him before. He noticed Mara watching. Not obviously. She didn't stand over anyone with a clipboard during the field problem the way evaluators sometimes did in training environments when they were more interested in form than substance. She moved with the element, carried her own kit, pulled her own security sector during the overnight rotation without asking for adjustment. She was simply present, observant in the way that certain people are observant, where you couldn't catch their eyes moving, but somehow they saw everything. The question of who she was had not gotten quieter. If anything, it had gotten louder, because watching her move through the field problem was watching someone who was not evaluating so much as recalibrating to an environment she had clearly spent a significant portion of her life in. She adjusted her kit differently than most people. The way she carried weight, forward, slightly compressed, weight high on the frame, wasn't logistics coordinator posture. It was the posture of someone who had moved long distances under load so many times the body had found its own optimization. Marsh noticed it too. He fell in beside Ethan during a movement-to-contact exercise at the 14-hour mark, both of them breathing hard with the altitude change, and said very quietly, "I looked up what I could find on her." "And?" Ethan said. "Nothing before 6 weeks ago. Official assignment history is clean back to a Virginia address, and then it just stops." Marsh paused. "But the assignment code on her transfer paperwork. I know a personnel sergeant who recognized it. Said the last time he saw that particular assignment code was on a file for a guy who'd spent 8 years attached to a DevGru support element." Ethan said nothing for a moment. The formation was moving around a low ridgeline, everyone spread into their spacing, the cloud cover making the light flat and directionless. "Naval Special Warfare," Ethan said. That's what he said. He could be wrong. He could be, Marsh said, but he wasn't sure he was. They moved for another 30 seconds in silence. "Cole," Marsh said, "the thing in the mess hall." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm just saying." "I know, Marsh." Marsh dropped it. They kept moving. Well, the crisis point of the 48-hour problem arrived at hour 19, in the dark, at approximately 0100 on the second night. The scenario introduced a simulated ambush, a pyrotechnic contact from a prepared position on the eastern flank, with role players moving to encircle the patrol base from 2 directions while the element was at minimum manning on the security rotation. The initial contact hit Ethan's sector. He responded correctly and immediately. Initiated suppression, called contact and direction on the radio, went to his rehearsed immediate action drill. The element came off their sleeping positions and into their fighting positions in under 60 seconds, which was reasonable given the conditions. The problem was the northern sector, where the second element of role players was moving. The soldier in the northern position was Private First Class Aaron Teller, 22 years old, 8 months out of basic training, and probably the least experienced person in the exercise. In the darkness and the noise of the contact, he misidentified the movement on his sector and called it as friendly forces returning from a patrol that had returned 40 minutes ago. By the time Ethan recognized the error, he heard Teller's radio call, and something in the brevity was wrong. The direction reference was wrong. The role players had reached the edge of the patrol base perimeter. Ethan made a decision in under 2 seconds. "Pull back," he said on the radio, loud and clear. "All elements, fall back to the secondary position. Move now." It was not the textbook response. The textbook response was to reinforce the threatened sector and hold the patrol base position. But the textbook assumed the threatened sector had sufficient personnel, which it didn't, and it assumed the encirclement wasn't already partially achieved, which it was. He abandoned the patrol base and moved the element to the secondary position, 40 meters back and uphill, which had better elevation and worse cover but a cleaner sightline in 3 directions. The scenario evaluator froze the action at 0118. The debrief happened at dawn. Everyone exhausted, no one having slept since the contact, the cloud cover finally breaking enough to let orange light through on the eastern ridge. Cross ran this one himself, with Mara standing to his left. "Teller," Cross said, "talk me through the identification call." Teller was honest about it in the way that very young soldiers sometimes are, with the particular courage of someone who hasn't yet learned to protect their ego at the expense of the lesson. "I panicked," he said. "The movement direction matched the patrol route, and I wanted it to be friendly, so I called it friendly." "Cognitive bias under stress," Cross said. "You saw what you wanted to see. That's not a character failure. That's physiology. What's the fix?" "Challenge protocol," Teller said. "I should have challenged before I called it." "Yes." Cross moved on. "Cole," he said, "the withdrawal decision." "I pulled the element back to the secondary position." "Not the textbook response." "No." "Explain your reasoning." Ethan had been turning it over since 0188. Teller's identification error had already compromised the northern sector. Reinforcing a compromised sector without additional personnel means committing assets to a position that may already be penetrated. The secondary position gave us elevation and observation at the cost of the patrol base. Given personnel and ammunition status at the time of the contact, holding the base wasn't a good bet. Cross looked at Mara. Mara said, "The withdrawal was the right call." It was the first unqualified positive assessment she had offered in 4 days. The soldiers around the debrief circle heard it and understood what it meant, and several of them looked at Ethan in a way that they hadn't before. Ethan looked at Mara. She was already writing in her notebook. "The element's response time coming off sleeping positions was reasonable," she said, without looking up. "Communications were better than day 3. The fundamental problem this exercise revealed was pre-mission surveillance of the patrol base approaches. The ambush position should have been identified during the initial establishment phase. That's a planning item." "Agreed," Cross said. "Teller." She looked at the young private, who straightened instinctively. "Your honesty in this debrief is noted. Don't let it make you comfortable. The honest accounting of a mistake is the beginning of the fix, not the fix itself." "Yes, ma'am," Teller said. She went back to her notebook. Cross dismissed the element to rest and food. Most of them moved immediately toward the patrol base food cache with the focus of the deeply depleted. Ethan stayed where he was for a moment, looking at the eastern ridge where the light was coming through. He heard boots on gravel behind him and turned to find Mara standing 4 feet away, closing her notebook. "The withdrawal was right," she said again quietly. "Not for the group this time. Just for him." "I second-guessed it all night," he said. "That's appropriate," she said. "Second-guessing a command decision you made under stress is how you find out if it was actually right. If you'd been certain the whole time, I'd be more worried." He looked at her. The morning light was harsh and flat, and it hit the bruise under her left eye, which had faded from purple to a muddy green-yellow, but was still visible, still there. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish it." She waited. "What I did in the mess hall was wrong. Not a misunderstanding, not an accident. I hit you because you didn't respond to me the way I expected, and that's not a justification. That's a description of a problem." He paused. "I don't know how to make that right." Mara looked at him for a long time. The wind came through the gap in the ridge behind her and moved her collar. "You don't make it right," she said finally. "There's no transaction for it. You just don't do it again." She held his gaze. "To anyone?" "Yes," he said. She nodded once, and it wasn't absolution. It wasn't warmth. It was acknowledgement. The smallest and most serious kind of acceptance that one person can extend to another. She started toward the food cache. "Chief?" he said. She stopped. "Who are you?" She turned halfway. The morning light caught the side of her face, and she looked, for just a moment, like someone thinking about a very different landscape than this one. "Someone who made a lot of mistakes," she said, "and survived most of them." She walked away. Ethan stood on the ridge in the flat morning light and realized 2 things simultaneously: that he had just received the most honest answer she had given anyone since she arrived at Fort Ravenwood, and that it had told him almost nothing. And then, before he had time to work out what to do with either of those things, the radio on his belt crackled. Cross's voice, crisp and without preamble. "Element leads. Assemble at the command position in 10 minutes. We have an unscheduled development." Ethan looked at the radio. Looked toward the command position, where Cross was already visible, standing with his back to the element and a satellite phone to his ear. The posture of a man receiving information he had not expected. The satellite phone came down from Cross's ear before Ethan reached the command position, but the quality of Cross's stillness in those last few seconds, the particular lockdown quality of a man processing information he was not going to show on his face, told Ethan that whatever the call had contained, it was not routine. Webb was already there, Ewan behind him. The other element leads arriving in pairs from the patrol base, some of them still chewing, all of them reading Cross's posture the same way Ethan was. Mara came last. She had her notebook closed, both hands free, and she stopped at the edge of the assembled group rather than moving to the front, which was where her position in the evaluation cadre should have put her. She stood slightly apart, watching Cross. Cross looked at his watch. Then he looked at the element leads. "We're compressing the timeline," he said. The final evaluation phase moves to today. 1400 hours, main briefing room, all personnel. Webb said, "Sir, we're still 18 hours out from the end of the field problem." "I'm aware." "What changed?" Cross looked at him flatly. "The timeline changed, Sergeant. Get your people fed and back to main post by 1300. He looked around the group. All personal kits secured, utilities changed. Everyone in that briefing room looking like they didn't spend the night in the dirt. He paused. "Questions?" There were no questions because the tone of the thing made clear that questions were not actually invited. Cross walked back toward the vehicle's staging point, and Ethan noticed that he pulled the satellite phone out again before he'd gone 15 meters. Ethan looked at Mara. She was already looking somewhere else. The vehicles rolled back into Fort Ravenwood at 12:48. 12 minutes to spare, which was enough time for a change of utilities and not enough time for anything else. The element moved through the barracks with the efficient, slightly frantic energy of people trying to meet a standard faster than is comfortable, and by 13:55 they were filing into the main briefing room, 31 soldiers and one Navy Chief Petty Officer, smelling of field soap and carrying the residue of 19 hours of continuous operations in the lines around their eyes. Major Cross was at the front of the room. Captain Reyes stood to his left. A third person was seated at the side table, a woman in Navy working uniform, captain's insignia, a face that was somewhere past 60 and looked like it had not significantly changed in the last 15 years. She had a tablet and a water bottle and the contained posture of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in any given room without needing to perform it. Mara came through the door last. She stopped when she saw the woman at the side table. Something happened in her face, brief, real, complicated. Not fear, not exactly surprise. Something older and more textured than either of those. She found a seat in the second row and sat down and put her notebook on her knee and looked at the front of the room with the expression of someone who has just recognized a landscape they'd hoped not to revisit. Ethan was 3 seats to her left. He saw it. He filed it. Cross opened without preamble. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the secret level and will remain in this room. Anyone who discusses the content of this briefing outside the appropriate channels will be handled under the applicable UCMJ provisions." He looked around. Clear. Not a question. The 5-day evaluation is formally concluded as of this moment. Your scores and assessments will be compiled and transmitted to your respective command elements within 72 hours. He opened his folder. The reason we're here is not the evaluation. The room shifted. Not much. A collective micro-adjustment of posture and attention, but Ethan felt it. 48 hours ago, a training accident at the Montrose Mountain Warfare Center, approximately 200 kilometers northeast of this position, resulted in 3 fatalities and an ongoing search and rescue operation. Cross looked up. "I want to be clear. This is not a combat situation, not an enemy action. It is a training accident with significant complications that have made the rescue operation non-standard." He put a terrain map on the projector. The Montrose Range. Ethan recognized the general geography, a high-altitude training area in the mountains north of the desert, the kind of terrain that was brutal in summer and actively hostile in October. A 12-person Special Operations training element was operating at approximately 10,400 feet elevation when an unexpected storm system moved through the area 22 hours ago. The storm has since cleared, but it left 3 dead and 4 personnel unaccounted for, with a 5th confirmed injured and in contact with rescue teams, but in a position that precludes helicopter extraction due to terrain. He clicked to a satellite image. A ridge system, broken and complex, with a narrow canyon system running east-west through the center. The 4 unaccounted personnel are believed to be in the canyon system here. He pointed. The injured personnel, a lieutenant commander, leg fracture confirmed, possible hypothermia, has been in contact via emergency radio, is here. He moved the pointer to a position on the canyon wall, a narrow ledge visible in the satellite imagery. She cannot move under her own power. The medevac window closes when the second weather system arrives, projected at approximately 2200 tonight. Ethan ran the math. 8 hours. "We are coordinating with the rescue teams already on the ground," Cross said, "but they are currently working the canyon floor search for the 4 unaccounted personnel and do not have the personnel or the specialized skills to run a simultaneous technical extraction from the canyon wall position. He closed the folder. Which is why we're here. He looked at Mara. Mara was already looking at him. Chief Callahan, Cross said, your assessment of the wall extraction problem. Every head in the room turned. Mara didn't react to the attention. She looked at the satellite image on the projector for approximately 4 seconds. Then she stood up. Satellite is how old, she said. 14 hours, Cross said. The storm would have changed the surface conditions on that section of the wall. She walked to the front of the room without being invited, which no one objected to, and stood in front of the projected image. She pointed to the ledge position. Vertical relief here is approximately 60 meters based on the scale. The ledge is narrow. I'd estimate 2 meters wide at the widest point, could be less. The approach route from above requires anchor placement in what looks like mixed rock, and if the storm deposited ice on that section, it did, Cross said. Ground teams reported ice on the upper sections. Then you're looking at a technical descent in winter conditions with anchor reliability issues, a casualty who can't assist her own movement, and an 8-hour window. She looked at the image. What's the team configuration for the extraction? That's what we're building, Cross said. Who else on this base has technical rope work and high-altitude casualty movement experience? Reyes said, from her position to Cross's left. Master Sergeant Polito has mountain warfare qualification. 2 others have basic mountaineering. Beyond that? Polito, Mara said. That's enough for a 4-person extraction team if the others can run anchor support. She turned to Cross. I need the detailed weather data for the canyon section, a complete equipment manifest from the post-mountain rescue cache, and a direct radio link to the injured officer's frequency. She paused. And I need it in the next 20 minutes. Cross said, it's already being pulled. The woman at the side table had not moved during any of this. She was watching Mara with an expression that was almost nothing, the practice neutral of someone managing a great deal of feeling through long discipline. And when Mara finally looked at her, the two of them held each other's gaze for a moment that had too much history in it to read from the outside. Admiral, Mara said. It was a greeting and a question and something else, all in 2 syllables. Chief, the woman said. That was everything that passed between them in front of the room. But it landed in the assembled soldiers like a stone in still water, and the ripples of it spread outward through the silence. The Admiral. A Navy captain's insignia, which Ethan had read correctly, but the form of address that Mara had used, direct, unambiguous, carrying no surprise at the presence of someone 3 ranks above her own, said something specific about the nature of their history. Ethan was looking at Mara and noticing things he hadn't put together before. The way she'd moved to the front of the room, not like an administrator suddenly called on, but like someone stepping into a space she was built for. The way she'd read the satellite image, not studying it, parsing it, the way you parse something you've looked at versions of 100 times. What qualifications does she hold, he said. He said it to Webb, quietly, leaning 2 inches to his left. Webb's expression said, I don't know, and that's the problem. The briefing broke into working groups at 14:15. Cross took Mara, Polito, and the 2 soldiers with mountaineering qualification into the equipment room. Reyes managed the logistics coordination, vehicle convoy to the staging point at the base of the Montrose Range, communications package, medical support for the extraction. Ethan was assigned to the convoy support element, which meant he was present but not in the decision space, and that was a particular kind of frustration that he recognized as informative. He used the 40 minutes before departure to do the things you do before going into the field. Check his kit, check his communications gear, check the person next to him. Marsh found him at the vehicle staging point. The woman at the table, Marsh said. I did some checking. Fast checking, Ethan said. I know people. Marsh looked at the mountains to the north, which were visible now, their upper section showing a dusting of new white. She's Rear Admiral Catherine Marlowe. She runs the Naval Special Warfare Development Group's training command. He paused. She doesn't make house calls. Or field calls. Whatever this is. Ethan thought about that. She came for Mara. That's what it looks like. Why? That, Marsh said, I don't know. The convoy was rolling by 1,500 am. The Montrose staging area was at 7,200 feet, which felt like nothing on the drive up, and felt like something when you got out of the vehicle and took your first deep breath and found it about 15% short of what your body expected. The air was cold, not Fort Ravenwood cold, but mountain cold, with a wet edge that the desert didn't have. The rescue coordination team was already there, a small group of range staff and civilian search and rescue personnel who had been working the canyon floor for 18 hours and showed it. They had a command tent with maps and a dedicated radio setup, and they briefed Cross and Mara together while the rest of the element staged equipment. Ethan was close enough to hear pieces of it. The 4 unaccounted personnel had been located. 2 were hypothermic but ambulatory and had been walked out by the canyon floor team in the last 2 hours. The other 2 were still being worked. The lieutenant commander on the ledge, whose name was Forsyth, had been in contact by radio every 30 minutes and was conscious, coherent, and cold, with a fractured tibia that she described, in terms that suggested both training and stubbornness, as manageable if someone would come get me. The ledge was accessible from above. The approach required a descent of approximately 55 meters from an anchor point on the ridge, in conditions that the range staff described as technical but not extreme, which was the kind of assessment that sounded reassuring until you understood that the range staff had made that assessment from the satellite image rather than from standing on the ridge. Polito, who had been in mountains longer than most people in the element had been in the military, looked at the image and then looked at the range staff and said, "I'll make that call when I can see the rock." "Fair," said Cross. Mara was already looking at the approach route. "The anchor placement," she said to Polito. 2 primaries, 1 backup. Mixed protection in that section. You'll be placing in whatever the rock gives you." "I know how to set an anchor," Polito said. Not offensively, just stating. "I know you do. I'm talking about the primary versus the backup. If the ice coverage on the upper section is significant, your primary placement options narrow. You want the backup set before you commit to the descent." Polito looked at the image. "Agreed," he said, and there was a quality in how he said it. A slight recalibration, the adjustment of someone who has recognized competence at their level and decided to engage with it rather than manage it. The 4-person extraction team was Mara, Polito, and 2 soldiers from the mountaineering qualified group, Sergeant Briggs and Corporal Nguyen. They would go to the ridge with the technical equipment. The remaining elements staged at the base, running logistics, medical support, and communications relay. The climb to the ridge approach point took 90 minutes. Ethan, on the radio relay team at the staging area, tracked them on the position reports coming in every 20 minutes. At 1740, Polito's voice came through the relay. "On the ridge, assessing anchor positions now." Then at 1751, "Ice is heavier than the image suggested, re-evaluating primary placement." Then nothing for 14 minutes, which was 14 minutes of the staging area maintaining calm discipline and the radio sitting there saying nothing, and the light starting to shift toward late afternoon. At 1805, Mara's voice came through. It was the first time Ethan had heard her on a radio, and the difference was specific and immediate. Not the quality of the voice itself, which was the same even, measured register she used for everything, but the command structure of the transmission. Brevity, clarity, sequencing. The voice of someone who had built the habit of radio communication in environments where ambiguity had consequences. Relay, extraction team, anchor set. 2 primaries confirmed solid, backup placed, preparing for descent. LT Commander Forsyth is conscious and responsive. She can accept a harness. Descent will take approximately 20 minutes, transfer and ascent estimate 40 to 50. We are on track for the weather window. Break. Medical team, prepare for a casualty with confirmed tib-fib fracture, possible early hypothermia, no other injuries confirmed. Have an insulated litter and warm fluids ready. Over. The medical team lead at the staging area, a sergeant named Calloway, acknowledged and started moving. Ethan looked up at the ridge, which was visible from the staging area as a dark line against the pale sky. He couldn't see them. He tried anyway. What? At 1731, before the extraction team had reached the ridge, Admiral Marlowe had come to stand beside him at the edge of the staging area. He hadn't heard her approach, which said something either about her movement habits or his attention, and he suspected both. "You're Cole," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the ridge. "Daniel Cross tells me you've had an interesting week." "That's one way to put it," he said. She had the kind of face that had been making assessments for so long it was just the resting state. She assessed him now, not unkindly, but thoroughly. "What do you make of her?" Marlowe said. Ethan took a moment with the question, because the honest answer was the only one that was going to be worth giving to this woman. "I don't know yet what she is," he said. "I know what she isn't, which is what I assumed she was." He paused. "And I know what I was, which is what caused the problem in the first place." Marlowe looked at him. "That's a more self-aware answer than I expected." "I've had a few days to work on it." Marlowe was quiet for a moment. "She's been trying to disappear for 18 months, she said. Not to him specifically, more as though she was saying it out loud to settle something. "Some people, after the kind of loss she's had, they need to go quiet for a while. I understand that." She paused. "But some people are not built to stay quiet. Eventually the situation finds them." "What situation?" Ethan said. Marlowe looked at him, a slight shift in her expression. "The kind where someone needs to be pulled off a ledge," she said, and looked back at the ridge. The radio came to life at 18:23. "Relay, extraction team, descent complete. We're on the ledge." A pause. "LT Commander Forsyth is in better shape than the radio suggested. She's cold and her leg is bad, but she's lucid and she's cooperative. Getting her into the harness now." Another pause, longer. "She wants to know who's running the extraction. I'm telling her Chief Callahan, Naval Special Warfare. She says..." And here there was a brief human pause that was nothing like Mara's usual transmission discipline. "She says that tracks." Calloway, next to Ethan, let out a short breath. The ascent took 53 minutes. It should have taken 40, but the ice on the upper section was worse than Polito's initial assessment, and at the 20-minute mark there was a 10-minute hold while the team dealt with a primary anchor that had moved under load in a way that was not catastrophic but required attention before they continued. During those 10 minutes, the staging area was very quiet. Marlowe stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the ridge and said nothing. Cross stood beside her and also said nothing. Ethan ran comm checks he didn't need to run because doing something was better than doing nothing, and Marsh stood beside him and did the same thing. At 19:16, the radio. "All personnel on the ridge. Casualty is stable, hypothermia developing, but pre-treatment protocol in place. Beginning descent to staging, ETA 40 minutes. The weather window was at 2200. They had time. The element came down off the mountain at 1957. Forsyth in a wheeled litter that Polito and Briggs ran over the terrain with the focused efficiency of people who were tired and not letting themselves be. Mara was at the head of the litter, Nguyen at the foot, both of them carrying their full kit on top of the extraction load. Ethan saw Mara's face when she came into the staging area light. It was the face of someone who had just done something that used everything, not depleted exactly, but emptied in the specific way that comes after full commitment, when the body has burned through its reserves and is running on the clean residue of completed purpose. She saw Marlowe immediately. She handed the litter to Calloway's team without breaking stride and walked directly to where Marlowe was standing. "Forsyth's harness fitting was wrong when we got to her," Mara said. "She'd rigged it herself during the storm. The main load point was off-center, and she'd been hanging from it long enough that she has bruising across the iliac. You need to brief her treating facility." "Noted," Marlowe said. "The canyon floor team needs to check the other 2 recovered personnel for the same thing. If Forsyth improvised her rig, they may have done the same." "I'll make the call," Marlowe said. Mara nodded. She started to turn. "Mara," Marlowe said. It was the first time Ethan had heard anyone use her first name. Mara stopped. "Well done," Marlowe said. Something moved in Mara's face, complicated and quick, the kind of thing that appears and disappears before you can categorize it properly. "She was on the ledge for 22 hours, Mara said. "That's who did well." She walked toward the vehicle's staging point. Marlowe watched her go with the expression of someone who has known a person for a long time and is watching them do the thing they always do and still finding it difficult. The convoy back to Fort Ravenwood departed at 20:45. Ethan was in the 3rd vehicle. Mara was in the 2nd. He couldn't see her from where he sat, which was fine because he had enough to look at inside his own head. He was thinking about the ledge, about the quality of Mara's voice on the radio when she'd reported the anchor set, not the professionalism of it, which he'd expected by that point, but the weight behind it. The weight of someone for whom the anchor, the descent, the casualty on the ledge were not abstract problems being solved, but things being done in a long chain of things that had been done before, in worse places, with higher stakes. He was thinking about what Marlowe had said. Some people are not built to stay quiet. He was thinking about the mess hall, which he'd thought about every day since it happened, but was thinking about differently now. Not as his mistake, he'd moved past the self-protective categorization of it, but as a specific revelatory failure. He had looked at Mara Callahan and seen a category. Older woman, administrative, non-threatening, and from that category he had pulled a conclusion about how she could be treated, which was the kind of reasoning that he now understood was not a one-time error, but a pattern that had been running in him for a long time. He had been applying it to Ewan, to Rourke, to Teller. He'd been applying it to anyone who didn't immediately fit the shape of what he thought strength was supposed to look like. The vehicle rolled through the dark desert, and Ethan sat with that for a while. Not comfortably, but honestly. They were back at Fort Ravenwood by 22:15. Forsyth had been transferred to the medevac at the mountain staging area. Destination, the military medical facility, 2 hours south. The canyon floor team had confirmed the other recovered personnel's harness rigs were standard. The 2 remaining unaccounted personnel from the original training accident had been located alive, cold, miserable, one with a shoulder injury, and were being walked out by the rescue team. The element dispersed through the post with the quiet efficiency of people who needed food and sleep and had decided that talking could wait. Cross stopped Ethan in the headquarters hallway. "Final evaluation scores compiled tomorrow morning," Cross said. "Whatever questions you have about the process, ask them now." "I don't have questions about the process," Ethan said. Cross looked at him. "About Callahan?" "Not tonight," Ethan said. And then, because Cross was looking at him like he was waiting for something specific, "She's not what her file says." "No," Cross agreed. "She isn't." "How much of what happened this week was the evaluation, and how much was something else?" Cross was quiet for a moment. The hallway was empty in both directions. The overhead fluorescents hummed. "The evaluation was real," Cross said. "Your scores are real. What Callahan did today was separate from the evaluation. But her being here in the first place, above your clearance level," Cross said, not unkindly. "And above mine, if I'm honest." Ethan accepted that. "Can I ask one more thing?" Cross waited. "The assignment code on her transfer," Ethan said. Marsh looked it up. He said it was attached to a DevGru support element. Cross said nothing for 3 seconds. "Get some sleep, Corporal," he said. "Morning brief is 0700. He walked away. Ethan stood in the hallway alone. DevGru, the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the most selective special operations unit in the United States military, and in the building that housed it, somewhere in the specific strata of those who supported it. A classification wall thick enough that a post-operations officer couldn't see past 6 weeks of it. He walked to the barracks. He passed the day room. Through the window, he could see Mara at the table where she always sat, notebook open, writing something in the small, dense handwriting he'd come to recognize. Her field jacket was still on. She hadn't been back to the barracks to change. She was writing like she needed to finish something before she could stop. He didn't go in. He kept walking, down the hall and into his rack, and lay in the dark for a while. The question he'd been carrying all week had changed shape. It wasn't "who is she" anymore. It was something more specific and more important, and he turned it over in the dark until he fell asleep. The question was, what happens to a person who has been that and then tries to be nothing? And the answer, watching her in that window, writing in her notebook in her field jacket at 22:30, alone in the day room while the base went quiet around her, was not what he had expected. It looked like maintenance, like a person doing the daily work of keeping themselves together in the only way they knew how to do it. It looked, in the worst and most human way, like survival. The 0700 brief. The following morning was Cross and Reyes administrative, the formal closeout of the evaluation exercise. Score distribution, record updates, return to unit assignments. The kind of brief that had the structure of conclusion but didn't feel like one. Mara was at the back of the room. At 0724, the door opened and Admiral Marlowe came in. Cross paused mid-sentence and nodded to her. She took a position at the side wall, tablet in hand, and nodded back. "Continue," she said. Cross continued. But the room had changed in the way rooms change when a person of significant rank enters with a specific kind of quietness, Not the quietness of someone waiting, but the quietness of someone who has already decided something and is here to execute that decision. When Cross finished, he looked at Marlowe. "Admiral, would you like to address the element?" "Briefly," Marlowe said. She stepped to the front of the room. She looked at the assembled soldiers for a moment without speaking, which was a specific kind of technique. The silence that precedes something that's meant to land. "Yesterday," she said, "a Naval Special Warfare officer is alive because the right person was in the right place. I want that on record. I also want on record that the right person was in the wrong place for 18 months before that, and that is—" She paused, and the pause had weight in it, a correctable situation. She looked at Mara. The room looked at Mara. Mara was looking at the wall. "Chief Petty Officer Callahan," Marlowe said. "I'd like a word after this brief." Mara looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," she said. And Ethan, watching from the third row, understood without being told that the word Marlowe wanted was not a brief administrative one, that it was the kind of word that changed the shape of what came next, for Mara, for the year ahead of her, possibly for the years beyond that. He also understood, watching Mara's face in the moment before she looked back at the wall, that she understood the same thing, and that she was, for the first time since he had known her, something he couldn't quite categorize. She was afraid. The brief ended at 0741. The element filed out with the specific relief of people who have been formally released from something, moving through the door in ones and twos, voices picking up in the hallway. Cross spoke briefly to Reyes at the front of the room. Marlowe stood at the side wall with her tablet and waited, and that waiting had a quality to it, patient, absolute, unmovable, that cleared the room faster than any instruction. Ethan left with the others. He got as far as the hallway, stopped, and leaned against the wall 2 meters from the door. Marsh walked past him and gave him a look that said, "Really?" and Ethan gave him a look back that said, "Yes," and Marsh kept walking. The door to the briefing room was not fully closed. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He told himself that and mostly believed it. But he stayed where he was, and after a moment he heard Marlowe's voice through the gap. Not the words, just the tone, which was the measured, serious register of someone making a case. And then Mara's voice, which was shorter, quieter, and sounded like someone who is prepared for a conversation and still finds it harder than they expected. He pushed off the wall and walked away. Some things were not his. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. He knew this because he went to the equipment bay and performed maintenance on his kit for 47 minutes, during which he checked everything twice and found 2 things that actually needed attention and fixed them, and then ran out of useful things to do and sat on the bench looking at his boots. At 0831, Mara came through the equipment bay on the way to the barracks. She was moving with the deliberate pace of someone managing something internal, her face arranged into the neutral expression he recognized now as the one she wore when something had happened that she wasn't ready to process in visible terms. "Chief," he said. She stopped, looked at him. The bruise under her eye was mostly yellow now, fading into the skin. "You all right?" he asked. The question surprised her. He could see it, a slight shift in her expression that said she'd expected something else, or nothing. "I'm fine," she said. "That's the same thing you told the medic on day 1, he said. A pause. The equipment bay was empty except for them, smelling of gun oil and boot polish, and the particular dry smell of stored gear. "It's a complicated morning," she said. "Do you want—" He started and then stopped because he wasn't sure what he was offering. She waited, which was a thing she was patient at in a way that he was still learning to be. "I don't know what I was going to say," he admitted. Something small and genuine moved in her expression. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent. "That's honest," she said. She shifted the notebook under her arm. "The Admiral wants me to take an assignment." "An instructor position," he said. He didn't know how he knew. It was the only thing that fit Marlowe being here. Mara looked at him steadily. "Yes." "Are you going to?" A long pause, long enough that he understood the answer wasn't simple. "I don't know yet," she said. She walked out. At 0900, Cross called Ethan to his temporary office, which was a room that normally functioned as a storage space for training materials and currently contained a field desk, a laptop, and 2 folding chairs. Cross was behind the desk. He gestured to the chair. Ethan sat. "Your evaluation results," Cross said, opening the laptop. Overall, you finished third in the combined element ranking. Your building clearance scenario cost you significantly on day one. Your medical response and command decisions in the latter half of the exercise recovered ground. He looked up. The withdrawal decision on day 4 night was the correct call. I want that in your record clearly, not just as a marginal note. I appreciate that, Ethan said. The less formal part of this conversation, Cross said, and closed the laptop. He leaned back in his chair. What did you learn? Ethan looked at the wall behind Cross, where someone had taped a topographic map of the training area that they hadn't bothered to take down. That I was allocating resources around my own performance instead of the mission, he said. That I was making assumptions about personnel capability based on criteria that weren't relevant. He paused. And that I hit a woman in a mess hall because she didn't behave the way I expected her to, and that's not a one-time mistake. It's the end product of a way of thinking I've been running for a while. Cross was quiet. The charges, Ethan said. She declined to press them. She did. That's in my record? The incident is documented, Cross said carefully. She declined charges. The documentation reflects both facts. Ethan nodded. I want to formally request remedial leadership development training, he said. Whatever the command has available, I want it on record that I requested it. Cross looked at him for a moment. That's not a small thing to put in your jacket voluntarily. No, Ethan agreed. It isn't. Cross made a note. A real one, not the kind people make to look like they're making notes. I'll process the request today. Ethan stood to go. Cole, Cross said, whatever you made of this week, don't lose it when you're back in a normal operating environment. That's where it matters. Yes, sir, Ethan said, and meant it. The formal declassification briefing happened at 1100. It was not announced as such. The notice said, all hands information brief, main briefing room, Y100, mandatory. Which was the kind of notice that told experienced soldiers nothing while still telling them everything. Because mandatory all-hands information briefs at military installations do not happen because someone wants to share good news about the commissary schedule. The element filed in. Cross at the front. Reyes to his left. Marlowe at the side table again. Mara in the second row, her notebook closed on her knee, her hands still. A fourth person was present. A man in his mid-50s in civilian clothes, a government badge visible on a lanyard that he had not tucked away. He sat beside Marlowe with a tablet and a folder and the specific blankness of someone from an intelligence or administrative function who has been present at many such briefings and treats them as routine regardless of the content. Cross opened. What I'm about to present is authorized for release by the relevant classification authority effective this morning. It will be entered into the operational record for this exercise and will constitute the official explanation for Chief Petty Officer Callahan's presence at this installation. He looked at the element without particular expression. This is not a discussion. It is a briefing. Questions through appropriate channels afterward. He clicked the projector. A service photograph appeared. Mara, approximately 10 years younger, in Navy working uniform, the rank insignia of a Chief Petty Officer. Below it, a unit designation, Naval Special Warfare Support Activity, Maritime Element. Chief Petty Officer Mara Callahan, Cross said, served for 19 years in active Naval Special Operations support roles, the last 11 of which were attached to classified Maritime Element operations under Naval Special Warfare Command. Her service record, classified until this morning, includes 12 operational deployments across 4 geographic combatant commands. The room was very quiet. During her final operational period, Chief Callahan served as Senior Medical and Tactical Support Specialist for an 8-person maritime element conducting operations in a denied access environment. In the course of those operations, the element sustained catastrophic contact that resulted in the loss of 4 personnel, including the element commander. He clicked again. A photograph. Desert terrain, the kind of landscape that could be several different countries, deliberately ambiguous. An aerial image. Below it, a citation number and a classification header that had been partially redacted. Chief Callahan was the last surviving mobile element member. She transported the element commander, Commander Lisa Torres, approximately 3 kilometers through active threat terrain with a dislocated shoulder and 2 fractured ribs. Commander Torres did not survive. Chief Callahan did. The photograph on the projector was replaced by another, a citation document, the text partially visible, the signature block showing a 3-star admiral's name. Chief Callahan was awarded the Navy Cross for her actions during this operation. Due to the classified nature of the operation, the award has been maintained in a restricted record until this morning. Cross looked at the element. Effective today, the classification on Chief Callahan's service record is reduced, and the relevant portions are being incorporated into her accessible file. He clicked off the projector. The room sat with it. 31 soldiers and the ambient sound of the ventilation system and nothing else for several seconds. Ethan looked at Mara. She was looking at the blank projector screen with an expression that was so controlled it was almost nothing, and the effort of that control was exactly what made it visible. The particular tightness of a person who is in a room full of people being told a story about themselves that they have never told, and holding the line. Her hands were flat on the notebook. Her knuckles were not white. She had enough control for that. But they were flat and still and deliberate, and Ethan understood in that moment what it cost her to sit in that chair while a stranger read out the worst day of her life in operational summary. Language in front of 30 people she barely knew. He looked away from her. It felt like the right thing to do. The room cleared at 11:27. Most of the element moved out with the complicated energy of people who have received significant information and haven't yet worked out what to do with it. There were no loud conversations in the hallway. It was the quieter, more internal processing that follows genuine surprise. Marsh appeared at Ethan's elbow. "Navy Cross," Marsh said very quietly. "Yes," Ethan said. "That's second highest decoration in the Navy." "I know what it is." "Cole." "I know," Ethan said. He kept walking. He found a quiet corner near the water fountain at the end of the hallway and stood there with his back to the wall and worked through what was in his chest, which was several things at once. Something that felt like shame in a form he hadn't encountered before, and something that felt like awe but wasn't quite that. And underneath both of those, something harder to name. He had put her on the floor. He had put her on the floor and called her a rookie, and she had gotten up with blood on her lip and walked out carrying her coffee, and she had a Navy Cross in a classified file and had carried her dying commander through 3 kilometers of hostile territory with a dislocated shoulder. And she had chosen not to press charges. Not out of weakness. Not out of avoidance. She had made a specific, deliberate decision that what he needed was not prosecution, but something that might actually change him. That decision, he now understood, was the most sophisticated tactical assessment anyone had made of him in his career. He found her at 1300 on the bench outside the headquarters building, the one that looked east toward the mountains. She was alone. Her notebook was closed. She was holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in the way coffee goes cold when the person holding it has forgotten about it. He sat down on the bench. Not close. He left space. She didn't look at him. "I'm not going to say I'm sorry again," he said. "I already said it and it wasn't enough, and saying it more doesn't fix that." "No," she said. "I want to say something else." She waited. "I've been thinking about what you said, in the day room, that it isn't about you." He looked at the mountains. The October light was hitting the upper sections at a low angle, making the new snow visible. "I understand that now. It was never about you. It was about a way I'd been operating, and you were just the person in the room when it came out." He paused. "That doesn't make it better." "No," she said again. "It doesn't. But it means the problem is mine to fix, not yours to forgive." She turned and looked at him for the first time since he'd sat down. The yellow bruise, the steady eyes. "That's a more useful way to think about it," she said. "Will you tell me about her?" he said. "Torres?" The name landed between them like something physical. Mara looked back at the mountains. Her jaw shifted. She drank from the cold coffee without seeming to notice the temperature. "She was better than anyone I've ever worked with," she said finally, "by a significant margin, not just tactically, as a person." She stopped. "I'm sorry," he said. "You don't have to—" "She had a daughter," Mara said. "She had a daughter who was 7 when it happened, and is 9 now, and doesn't know exactly what happened to her mother, and won't for years, if ever." She set the coffee down. "Lisa was the reason I kept my record clean. The reason I documented everything, kept every procedure current, showed up to every training evolution even when I could have passed on most of them. Because she expected that. She held the line herself, and she expected the people around her to do the same." She was quiet for a moment. After she died, I convinced myself I could just stop, Mara said. That I'd earned it. That I'd paid enough. She looked at her hands. The logistics detail here was supposed to be invisible. I was supposed to be invisible. Do the paperwork, don't engage, count the months. And then I hit you in a mess hall, Ethan said. And then you hit me in a mess hall, she agreed. There was no warmth in it. But there was, somewhere underneath, the flat, factual tone of someone who has decided to be honest about something they'd rather avoid. Marlowe's offer, Ethan said. The instructor position. Mara picked up the cold coffee again, looked at it, put it down. Naval Special Warfare Center Pacifica, she said. Instructor cadre for advanced operator training, medical and tactical integration. She paused. It's a good position, the right position, probably. But I've been not doing it for 18 months because the alternative was easier. She said it without self-pity, just as information, the way she assessed everything. The alternative being, stay small, stay quiet, don't be the person who does things like what happened yesterday. You don't get to choose that, Ethan said. Being that person, you just are. She looked at him with the gray eyes. That might be the most useful thing you've said all week, she said. At WUMP 400, the classified briefing room, a smaller, windowless space adjacent to Cross's temporary office, was opened for a secondary briefing that Cross had scheduled for the element leads only. 6 people. Cross, Reyes, Mara, Ethan, Webb, and Polito. Cross opened with logistics. The evaluation records were being transmitted. The formal documentation of the Montrose extraction was being processed through appropriate channels. Administrative closeout of the exercise was on track for 48 hours. Then he said, Chief Callahan has agreed to respond to questions about her record and service history within the bounds of what has been declassified as of this morning. This is voluntary on her part. You will not ask about anything that is still marked restricted. If you go there, she will tell you, and we move on. He looked at the group. This is an unusual situation, and I want to handle it correctly. Questions. Webb went first. The maritime element. What was the operational mission set? Mara sat with her forearms on the table and her hands loosely folded. The briefing posture, contained, ready. Maritime direct action and personnel recovery in denied access environments, she said. We worked in places where conventional forces couldn't operate and air assets couldn't reach or survive. Small element, high autonomy, long-duration missions. Medical support in that context, Polito said. You were the element medic? Senior medical specialist. In practice, yes. I was the medical capability for the element. But in that environment, medical and tactical overlap significantly. You're not a medic who happens to carry a weapon. You're an operator who happens to have advanced medical training. The dislocated shoulder, Reyes said quietly. She said it carefully, like someone who has been thinking about whether to ask it. During the extraction of Commander Torres, I reset it myself, Mara said, at the 400-meter mark. It took about a minute. She said it without drama, the way you described something that was necessary and therefore was done. Reyes absorbed that. And then you kept moving. And then I kept moving. Webb shifted in his seat. The 19 years, all of it in Nisasbao? First 4 in conventional medicine, corpsman, then surgical tech. Then I qualified for the maritime program and that was the rest of it. She paused. It was the right work. It was where I was supposed to be. Was, Polito said. She looked at the table for a moment. The instructor position, she said. I've agreed to take it. The room absorbed this. As of when? Cross asked. I gave Admiral Marlowe my answer at 13:30, Mara said. I report to Pacifica in 60 days. Cross nodded, once, with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan had come out correctly without him having to do very much. The evaluation, Ethan said. Everyone looked at him. Your being here, the logistics detail, the evaluation cadre assignment, was any of it coincidence? Mara looked at him. A pause. Major Cross, she said. Do you want to answer that? Cross looked at Ethan. Chief Callahan was identified as a candidate for the instructor position 8 months ago. Admiral Marlowe determined that a return to operations evaluation in a field environment would be an appropriate prerequisite. The logistics detail and the evaluation cadre assignment provided that environment. So this entire exercise, Ethan said slowly, was a real exercise, Cross said. Your evaluations are real. The scores are real. The Montrose extraction was not planned. He paused. But the environment was constructed to give Chief Callahan an opportunity to find out if she was ready. And, Ethan said, she set the anchor, ran the descent, and brought Forsyth up a 60-meter wall in ice conditions in an 8-hour window, Polito said. He said it with the voice of someone who had been on that wall and had a specific opinion about what it had required. I'd say that answers the question. Mara was looking at the table. Chief, Cross said, anything you want to add for the record? She looked up. She looked at the group. The evaluation was useful, she said. The scenarios exposed things I needed to examine. The personnel... She paused, and her eyes moved briefly to Ethan and away. Were more complicated than I expected, in ways that were ultimately useful. It was the most she was going to say about it in this room. Everyone understood that. The afternoon ran administrative and quiet. Records to sign, gear to account for, the institutional paperwork of a 5-day exercise wrapping itself up in the way institutional paperwork does, slowly, with multiple redundant signatures. Ethan ran into Ewan at the supply office at 600. She was signing off on equipment returns with the focused efficiency of someone who wanted to be done and was getting there. Ewan, he said. Cole. She looked up. Pacifica, he said. Do you know where that is? She looked at him for a moment. Naval Special Warfare Center, California coast. Why? I'm thinking about what comes after this assignment, he said. Specifically what the leadership development pathway looks like, if you actually want to be the kind of leader who knows how to use the people around him. Ewan looked at him steadily. That's a different question than the ones you were asking a week ago. Yes, he said. It is. She considered him. There are programs, she said. The Army has a few. There are joint pathways through NIA South 1000 training support if you can get a cross-service assignment. She paused. Why are you asking me? Because a week ago I wasn't asking you anything, he said, and that was the problem. She looked at him for a long moment, then she went back to her forms. I'll send you some links, she said. No promises on whether they're still current. That's all I'm asking, he said. He left the supply office and walked through the post in the late afternoon light, which was hitting the desert at the angle that turned everything a specific shade of orange that made the dust visible in the air and the mountains look closer than they were. He was thinking about what came next, not in the abstract, in the specific, the leadership training request he'd made to Cross, the evaluation results, the conversation with Ewan. He was also thinking about Mara and about Torres and about the shape that loss leaves in a person, not the romantic version of it, the clean scar version, but the real version, which is complicated and non-linear and sometimes looks like a woman sitting on a bench holding a cold coffee staring at mountains she doesn't see. He was thinking about the Navy Cross in the classified file. He was thinking about what it means to carry your dying commander 3 kilometers with a dislocated shoulder and then spend 18 months on a logistics detail because the alternative of being fully alive felt like more than you could stand. He was thinking that he had, on a Tuesday morning in a mess hall, been the thing that interrupted that 18 months. He wasn't sure yet what he thought about that. At 1830, the element gathered informally in the day room, not at anyone's direction, just the natural accumulation of people who had been through something together and had not yet fully separated from it. Someone had acquired a case of something cold and distributed it without ceremony. Mara was not there initially. She came in at 1845, got a coffee from the station, and took her usual table near the window. She had her notebook, but she wasn't writing in it. She had it on the table in front of her, and she was just sitting, which was something Ethan had not seen her do before. Just sitting. Not working, not observing, not recording. Teller, the young private who had misidentified the ambush movement on the night exercise, crossed the room with the specific courage of a 22-year-old who has decided to do something and committed to it. He stopped in front of Mara's table. "Chief," he said, "can I sit?" She looked at him. "Yes." He sat. The ambush night. The misidentification call. He was not comfortable, but he was direct, which Ethan noted. "You said the honest accounting of a mistake is the beginning of the fix, not the fix itself." "Yes," she said. "What's the fix?" Mara looked at him for a moment. She turned her coffee in her hands. You practice the challenge protocol until it's automatic, she said. Not because you think you'll panic again, because you accept that you might, and you build the response so deep it runs before the panic can override it. She paused. And then you practice it some more. Teller absorbed that. That's it? That's most of it. She picked up the coffee. The rest is accepting that you made the call you made, and being honest about why, and not letting the honesty become self-punishment that stops you from making the next call. Teller sat with that. Did you ever make a call like that? He said. Under pressure. The wrong one. The room was ambient. Other conversations, movement, the television. But the small pocket around Mara's table was quiet. Yes, she said. He waited to see if she would say more. She didn't. But the fact that she'd said yes without deflection, without qualification, without redirecting, was its own kind of answer, and Teller seemed to understand that. Thank you, he said, and got up and went back to where Marsh and Rourke were, and was immediately folded back into their conversation, the way the young can move from serious to ordinary in moments that take older people much longer to make. Mara sat for a while longer with her coffee and her closed notebook. At 19:30, she stood, picked up her things, and stopped beside Ethan's chair on her way out. He looked up. I'm going to be gone before the formal closeout tomorrow, she said. My orders moved up. She paused. Admin doesn't look like much from the outside. You've all been respectful of the work anyway, which I noticed. Most of us, Ethan said. Most of you, she agreed, which is better than some places I've been. She looked at him with the gray eyes that had stopped being unreadable to him, not because they showed more, but because he'd learned how to look at them correctly. The leadership program, she said. Do it. Not because Cross recommended it, and not because it looks good in your jacket. Do it because it's the work. I know, he said. I know you know, she said. I'm saying it anyway. She started for the door. Chief, he said. She stopped without turning. For what it's worth, he said, Torres would have been proud of what you did on that wall yesterday. The silence that followed was long enough to have weight. She didn't turn around. She stood with her back to the room for a moment, just a moment, and the set of her shoulders said something that her voice, when it came, didn't need to say. Yeah, she said quietly. I think she would have. She walked out. The day room stayed with the sound of other people's conversations and the television and the particular texture of an evening after a hard week, and Ethan sat in his chair and looked at the door she'd gone through and understood, with a clarity that felt earned in a way few things had, that he had been in the presence of something he would spend a long time catching up to. The next morning, at 05:30, he walked past the empty table by the window on his way to the coffee station. The notebook was gone. So was she. The empty table stayed empty through the morning brief and through the administrative closeout and through the meal that followed, and Ethan was aware of it the way you're aware of a sound that has stopped. Not its presence, but the shape of where it had been. Fort Ravenwood processed the end of the exercise the way bases process everything, with forms and signatures, and the machinery of institutional memory recording what had happened in language drained of everything that had actually made it matter. The evaluation scores were transmitted. The Montrose extraction report went through channels. Personnel orders were updated. By 1400, the combined element had formally disbanded. People moved to vehicles and transport connections with the specific efficiency of soldiers returning to the lives that had been paused for a week. Ethan signed his closeout paperwork at 1347, shook Cross's hand at 1355, and drove out of Fort Ravenwood at 1410 into the desert that was starting its shift from summer heat toward the thin, cold air of a high desert November. He had a 7-hour drive ahead of him. He used the first 2 thinking about what he was going to do with what the week had left in him, which was the useful kind of thinking, and the next hour not thinking about much at all, which was the necessary kind. And then he pulled off at a rest stop outside a town small enough not to have a name on most maps, and sat in the vehicle for a while watching a dust devil work its way across the open ground to the east. He pulled out his phone, looked at the Leadership Development Program links that Ewan had sent him the previous evening, which he hadn't opened yet. He opened them. There were 4. 2 Army programs, 1 joint, one that ran through a civilian university partnership with a DoD component. He read through each summary carefully, the way he'd learned this week to read briefings, looking for what they didn't say as much as what they did. He sent a request for application packets to all four before he pulled back onto the highway. 60 days moved the way. 60 days moves when a person is doing the work. Not quickly and not slowly, but with the specific texture of time that is being used rather than spent. Mara arrived at Naval Special Warfare Center Pacifica on a Wednesday in December, when the California coast was doing what it did in December, which was a low marine layer that made everything gray and wet and smell of salt and cold iron. The base was on a stretch of coast south of a small city, backed by low hills and fronted by the Pacific, which was doing what it always did in December, which was demonstrate that it did not care about anything happening on land. She checked in at 0830. She was assigned quarters in the instructor cadre building, a two-story structure that smelled of wood and the particular brand of institutional cleaner that seemed to exist in every military facility regardless of branch. Her room was a room, a bed, a desk, a window that looked west toward the water. She put her bag on the bed and stood at the window for a while. The Pacific was gray and opaque and vast, and it looked the way it always looked to her, which was like something that was older than anyone's problems. She unpacked the bag methodically. Uniforms. Kit. The small collection of things that traveled with her. A photograph in a battered frame, a watch that had belonged to someone else, a combat knife in a leather sheath worn smooth at the handle from years of handling. She put the photograph on the desk. Lisa Torres, mid-30s, laughing at something out of frame, the desert background of a training site bleached pale behind her. She put the knife on the desk beside it. She went to meet her new commanding officer, Commander Hugh Sato ran the instructor cadre at Pacifica with the contained efficiency of someone who had spent a career building things that worked and had strong opinions about what working meant. He was 51, compact, with the kind of face that smiled rarely and sincerely when it did. He had read Mara's declassified file and, she suspected, whatever was available of the restricted portions, and he greeted her with the specific directness of someone who doesn't believe in extended orientation rituals. "You've seen the program structure," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What do you think?" She sat in the chair across from his desk. She had opinions about the program's structure, and she'd been deciding for the last 2 days how much to share on the first meeting. She decided to share them. "The medical integration component is 6 weeks," she said. "It should be 10. The way it's currently structured, candidates finish the medical block and immediately move to the tactical integration block, which means they're applying medical skills under stress before those skills are fully automatic." Sato looked at her. "The timeline is driven by the overall course length." "I know. The overall course length can absorb 2 additional weeks in the medical block if you compress the administrative evaluation periods in weeks 8 and 9. The evaluation content doesn't require a week each. It requires 3 days each if the assessment is well designed. You've been here 4 hours. I read the program documentation on the way here." Sato's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, the micro-adjustment of someone recalibrating upward. "Write it up," he said. "Full proposal. Give me something I can take to the program board." "When do you need it?" 2 weeks. "You'll have it in 1, she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You're going to be an adjustment for this cadre," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll try to make the adjustment worth it." He almost smiled. "Dismissed, Chief. Orientation brief is at 1400. The first class arrived in January. 16 candidates, the result of a selection process that had reduced an initial pool of 63 to the 16 standing in the briefing room on a Tuesday morning with the specific look that advanced selection candidates carry, which is the look of people who have survived considerable difficulty and are aware that the difficulty ahead will be different and likely worse. Mara stood at the front of the room with the other 2 primary instructors. She let the senior instructor, a master chief named Delgado, run the opening brief. She stood slightly to the side and watched the candidates the way she watched everything, thoroughly, without being obvious about it. She was looking for the ones who were already performing, not the ones who looked sharp or sounded sharp or had the physical markers of people who had been selected for physical capability. She was looking for the ones who were watching the room instead of being watched by it, the ones whose eyes moved to the exits and the other candidates and the instructors with the particular pattern of people building a map rather than attending an event. There were 3 of them. She made a mental note and told herself to revisit it in 72 hours because first impressions in selection environments were frequently wrong in ways that mattered. When Delgado finished and nodded to her, she stepped to the front of the room. "My name is Chief Callahan," she said. "I run the medical and tactical integration component of this program. You will see me in medical scenarios, in tactical scenarios, and in the field problems. I do not have a secondary assignment. This is my only job, which means I have no competing priority when it comes to your training." She looked at the group. "A few things before we start." She let the pause run for 2 seconds. "You were selected because you are capable," she said. "I want to be specific about what that means in this context. It means you have demonstrated the physical and cognitive baseline required to begin this program. It does not mean you are finished products. The candidates who have been through this program and failed, and there have been many, were not less physically capable than the ones who succeeded. They failed because capability without integration is incomplete." She paused. "What we're building in this program is integration, the ability to apply your individual skills under conditions designed to make individual skills insufficient." She looked at the room. 16 faces with 16 different versions of the same expression, the careful neutrality of people who want to understand the rules before they react to them. "One more thing," she said. "If you have a problem with the training, a real problem, a safety concern, a situation where you believe the design of an exercise is creating unnecessary risk, you come to me directly. I will listen. I will not always agree with you, but I will always listen." She picked up her notebook from the desk. Questions. 1 hand. A candidate in the second row, mid-20s, the compact build and measured stillness of someone with a wrestling background or similar. "What's the failure rate for this course?" he asked. "Historically, 42%, she said. "Last class, it was 31. The class before that, 55. She looked at him. "Those numbers don't predict your outcome. Your daily work does." He nodded and put his hand down. She looked at the group one more time. "Let's start," she said. The weeks built on each other, the way good training builds, not steadily, not comfortably, but with the irregular rhythm of a process that is genuinely trying to find the limits of what each person contains. Mara's medical integration block ran 8 weeks after the program board approved her restructured proposal. She'd had the 2 additional weeks and the compressed evaluation periods and a modified assessment design that Sato had annotated with the words, "This is better" in the margin, which was as much editorial enthusiasm as he apparently produced. She was in the field 3 days out of 5. She ran casualty scenarios in conditions that escalated from controlled to genuinely uncomfortable. Temperature, duration, degraded communications, compounding complications. She debriefed every scenario the same way Cross had taught her, or rather the same way she'd always done it. Specific, honest, without softening the assessment into something that felt better and taught less. She was not a gentle instructor. She was not a cruel one. She was demanding in the specific way that comes from having been in places where the difference between adequate and excellent was not an abstract professional concern, but a practical matter of who came home. The 3 candidates she'd identified on the first morning turned out to be one who justified the identification completely, one who plateaued in week 5 in a way that concerned her and then broke through it in week 6 in a way that didn't, and one who washed out in week 7 for reasons that had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with a personal situation that had been building off base for months. She spent an hour with that candidate before they processed out, not to talk them back in, because the decision had been made and was correct, but because the hour was owed. "You didn't fail because you couldn't do the work," she told him. "You failed because you were trying to do the work, and something else simultaneously, and the something else was bigger than this program right now." The candidate, his name was Torres, which she had noted on day 1 and had deliberately not made anything of, looked at her with the expression of someone trying to decide whether they're being managed or told the truth. "Is that supposed to make it better?" he said. "No," she said. "It's supposed to be accurate." She paused. "Come back when the something else is resolved. The program will still be here." He left. She sat in her office for 10 minutes doing nothing, which was the amount of nothing the situation required. Then she went back to work. In February, a letter arrived. Physical mail, which was unusual enough that she looked at it for a moment before she opened it. A standard envelope with an Army installation address in the return corner and handwriting she recognized after a second. Ethan Cole. She opened it at her desk, The photograph and the knife were to her left. The Pacific was doing its gray thing outside the window. Chief Callahan, I'm writing this on paper because email felt wrong for what I'm trying to say, which is probably going to tell you something about where my head is. I started the Leadership Development Program in January. It's a 12-week joint program running out of the installation here. The first week I thought I already knew most of it. The second week I understood I didn't. By week 3 I had stopped taking notes on what I disagreed with and started taking notes on what I'd been doing wrong. I told you in the day room that I didn't know what to do with you. I've been thinking about that. I think what I meant was, I didn't know what to do with the version of myself that had walked into that mess hall and done what he did. I'm working on it. That's what I can say with any honesty right now. I'm working on it. Teller made it through the first phase of his advanced training selection. Marsh made E7. Ewan is apparently doing something interesting with a joint medical assignment that she won't tell me much about but seems satisfied with. I thought you'd want to know. I don't expect a response. I just thought you should know these things. Some of them happen because of you. Cole. She read it twice. Then she put it on the desk beside the photograph. She picked up a pen and wrote a response on the back of an envelope because she didn't have notepaper, and the envelope was what was in front of her. Cole, keep going. Callahan. She mailed it the next morning. The first class graduated in April. 9 of the original 16. The 42% historical failure rate had been close, 43.75, which Delgado noted dryly was within normal parameters, and Mara noted was 9 people who were now more capable than they had been in January, which was the number that mattered. The graduation ceremony was short and functional in the way that operational training graduations tend to be. No extended speeches, no ceremony for ceremony's sake. Sato spoke for 4 minutes. Delgado presented the certificates. The graduates moved through with the look of people who had been through something and knew it and didn't need it named. Mara stood with the cadre at the side of the room. After the ceremony, the candidate she'd identified on day 1, whose name was Ruiz, who had justified the identification completely, and then some, stopped in front of her. "Chief," she said, "Ruiz." "The medical integration block." Ruiz paused. "Week 6. The scenario where the casualty had the compound fracture and the tension pneumo simultaneously." "Yes. I made the wrong call on prioritization." "You made the second best call," Mara said. "The tension pneumo was the immediate threat. You went to the fracture first." "I know." Ruiz held her gaze. "I've been thinking about why." "And?" "Because the fracture was visible and the pneumo wasn't," Ruiz said. "I treated what I could see instead of what was killing her." "Yes," Mara said. "How do you stop doing that?" Mara looked at her. "You practice the assessment until the invisible threats show up in the assessment as reliably as the visible ones. And you accept that you will still occasionally treat the fracture first, because that's what humans do under pressure. And the goal is to reduce the frequency, not achieve the impossible standard of eliminating the error." Ruiz absorbed that. "That's a less reassuring answer than I was hoping for." "I know," Mara said. "It's the honest one." Ruiz looked at her for a moment. "Did you ever treat the fracture first?" The room was thinning out around them. The light through the windows was the pale April light of a coast morning. "Yes," Mara said. Ruiz waited. "More than once," Mara said, "in situations where it cost something." She paused. "The ones where it cost the most are the ones that made me better at the assessment." She let that sit for a moment. "That's not a comfort. It's just what happened." Ruiz nodded, once, with the look of someone who has received information they will carry for a long time. "Thank you," she said, "for the program, for the way you ran it." "Do good work," Mara said. "That's all the thanks I need from any of you." Ruiz left. The room finished clearing. Sato appeared at Mara's elbow with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he handed her without ceremony. "Second class starts in 6 weeks, he said. "I know. Your restructured medical block is being proposed as a model for 2 other programs in the Nisavdao's training pipeline." He drank his coffee. "The program board wants a briefing in May. I'll prepare it." He looked at her sideways. "You're settling in." She thought about that. Outside the window, the Pacific was doing its thing, gray and constant and vast and entirely indifferent to anything happening in the room. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." In May, Ethan Cole completed the Leadership Development Program. He was not the top graduate. He was third, which was accurate. The two above him had more experience and had worked harder than he had at the beginning before he'd understood what the program was actually asking. By the final 4 weeks, the gap had narrowed considerably. By the final evaluation, the three of them were, by the assessment team's notation, within measurement error of each other. He stood at the completion ceremony in the dress uniform he hadn't worn since the previous year and listened to the program director speak about leadership as a practice rather than a trait, which was the most useful thing anyone had said in 12 weeks, because it meant the work didn't stop when the program did. After the ceremony, he called his mother. She answered on the second ring, which she always did, with the voice of someone who had been waiting for the call without admitting she was waiting. "How was it?" she asked. "It was hard," he said. "I learned a lot." "About what?" He stood on the steps outside the ceremony hall in the May afternoon, squinting into the sun. "About how to be around people," he said. "How to use people well. How to not confuse being strong with being right." A pause. His mother had the particular silence of someone who recognizes that their child has said something true and surprising. "That's good," she said finally. "That's really good." "Yeah," he said. "I'm still working on it." He looked at the sky. "I've got some requests in for follow-on assignments. One of them is in California. There's a joint training program that has some medical and tactical integration components that I want to understand better." "California is nice," his mother said. "It is," he agreed. He didn't tell her why specifically he was interested in California. That was its own thing, not fully formed, not something he had a right to name yet. But it was there, the recognition that there were things he needed to understand that required proximity to someone who understood them. And that proximity, if it happened, would not be a convenience, but an earned thing, built over time through work. He put his phone in his pocket and walked to his vehicle in the May afternoon. Mara was on the training range at Pacifica on a Thursday in June when she heard about Ethan's assignment request. She heard about it from Sato, who mentioned it in the context of a joint program coordination call he'd been on, during which the Army's personnel liaison had flagged a cross-service request from a corporal, recently promoted Sergeant Cole E., for a training support role with the Niesavbazer's instructor cadre at Pacifica on a 6-month joint assignment basis. Sato told her this in the flat, informational tone of someone relaying relevant facts. She listened in the flat, informational posture of someone receiving them. "Your call," Sato said. "The request names you specifically as the point of contact." "He'd need a medical and tactical qualification review," she said. "His evaluation record from Fort Ravenwood is in the system." "I've seen it," Sato said. "His scores from day 4 and 5 are strong. Day 1 was a problem." "Day 1 was accurate," she said. "It's what he started with. The trajectory is what matters." Sato looked at her. "Is that a recommendation?" She thought about the letter on her desk, next to the photograph and the knife. She thought about the bench at Fort Ravenwood and the cold coffee and the mountains to the east. She thought about what it meant to look at a person and see only the category they fit at first glance, and what it cost when that was the only thing you were willing to see. She thought about what it meant to change. "Approve the request," she said. "Give him a real workload from day 1. If he's serious, the workload will show it. And if he isn't, he'll process out and we'll both know it," she said. "But I don't think that's what happens." Sato made a note. "He arrives in August." She went back to the range. The second class arrived in June. 14 candidates, different faces, the same look. The look of people who have survived the selection and are aware the harder part is starting. Mara stood at the front of the briefing room with Delgado and the new third instructor, a lieutenant commander named Briggs, who had a dry humor that balanced Delgado's severity in ways Mara had found, after 2 weeks, genuinely useful. She looked at the 14 candidates. She thought about Torres in the frame on her desk. She thought about what it had meant to carry someone who could not carry herself. She thought about what it meant to be the one who came back when the person you would have traded places with did not. She had spent a long time believing that surviving was a kind of debt, that the weight of it was what she owed. She understood now, not completely, not without the work of understanding that never fully finishes, that the debt was not the weight. The debt was what you built with what surviving gave you. You paid it by showing up, by doing the work that used everything you had, by standing in front of 14 people who needed to become more than they were and telling them the truth about what that required. Not the clean version, the actual version, with the errors and the costs and the calls made under pressure that you replayed for years and still weren't sure about. "My name is Chief Callahan," she said. "I run the medical and tactical integration component of this program." She looked at the room. "A few things before we start." Outside, the Pacific was doing what it always did. The marine layer was sitting on the hills. The range smelled of salt and gun oil and the particular cold of a California June morning that never quite made up its mind to be warm. She thought about Torres, who had ordered her to survive and had not survived herself. She thought about what it meant to honor that order in full. Not just to continue living, but to use the living. To make the years count in the way that Torres, who had been building something in her own people before she died, would have recognized and called by its right name. She thought about the 9 people who had graduated in April and were now somewhere in the operational pipeline, carrying what they'd built here into situations she would never know about. But that would be real and consequential, and might, on one specific day, in one specific set of circumstances, turn on whether they treated the fracture or the pneumo first. She thought about a 22-year-old named Teller learning to run the challenge protocol until it was automatic. About Ewan and her joint medical assignment. About Marsh, E7, which was the right rank for the person he was becoming. About Ethan Cole, arriving in August, who was not finished and knew it, and was working on it, which was all any of them were and all any of them could be. She thought about the woman she had been in the mess hall at Fort Ravenwood, on the floor, blood on her lip, calculating the geometry of a response she chose not to make. She had been right not to make it. Not because restraint was always right, but because what happened after, the 5 days in the field and the mountain and the conversation on the bench and the letter that came in February and the 9 graduates in April and the 14 people standing in front of her right now, none of it would have happened if she'd made the 3-second calculation into action. Sometimes the hardest thing you can do with your strength is know when not to use it. And sometimes the thing that looks like weakness from the outside is the most deliberate and difficult choice you have ever made. She had been choosing it her whole career without fully understanding what she was doing. She understood it now. "Let's start," she said. And she meant it in every direction that the phrase could mean. The class, the day, the next months, the work that would continue after this class, and the one after that. The slow building of something that would outlast her and the people she trained, the way Torres's own teaching had outlasted her and Mara, who was still here, still carrying it, still making it matter. The 14 candidates looked at her. She looked back. The Pacific moved outside the window, gray and constant and entirely indifferent, the way things that are much larger than any individual story tend to be. She opened her notebook to the first clean page. Strength isn't the thing you carry into a room. It's the thing you leave behind in the people who needed it most, and the courage to know which one matters more.